Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we're exploring what it takes to push the limits of human endurance, to run, swim, and climb through the world's most extreme environments, all before turning 26. Our guest is Louis Alexander, a Guinness World Record-holding adventurer from London, whose feats have taken him from the frozen landscapes of Antarctica to the sweltering waters of the Arabian Sea. He's the first and only person to complete marathons on all 7 continents and swim marathons in all 7 seas. His relentless pursuit of challenge has earned him recognition from National Geographic and an invitation to speak at 10 Downing Street, and even the title of Modern Day Byron from the Times. Over 663 days, Louis has braved the Amazon rainforest, crossed historic shipping lanes, and tested himself against the world's most unforgiving elements, all while raising tens of thousands for charity. Today, we dive into the mindset, the grit, and the vision behind his extraordinary journey. Louis, welcome to the campfire.
Thank you, bro. Wow, what an unbelievable introduction. That is... I think we're going to have to take a little bit of that. I'm going to have to ask if I can save that to use that somewhere one day, because that was incredible. Thank you, Scott. Very.
I got news for you, brother. This is all stuff right from you. I mean, this is you. It's amazing.
I think it was a team effort. I think you brought half the energy, and that was amazing. Amazing. Very, very kind.
Well, I mean, there is so much, and you and I chatted quite a bit before we started recording here, and there's so much to pack into an episode here. I don't know how we can possibly do it, but I'd like to just dive right in and just I want to like to start with this idea of being a professional full-time adventurer. This is something that you have set out to accomplish and are now doing. And honestly, it's kind of hard, I think, for me and for a lot of people to get their head around this idea of being a full-time professional adventurer. What does that mean?
That's one of the most common questions I get, right? Is what actually is an adventurer? And I totally get it, because before I started this journey, I didn't know that was a job title. That certainly wasn't a job title that I was ever sort of offered or suggested at school or growing up. Fundamentally, to me, being a full-time professional adventurer is someone who works full-time on their adventures. So I went on my first adventure when I was 19, and then I went full-time at 22 years old, and I'm now 25. So I'm in my 4th year now doing this full-time, so incredibly lucky. And I think full-time adventurer has no real definition. Some people focus on wildlife. Some people focus on different sports. They may be the best mountaineer, the best runner, whatever it is. I think mine is a bit of a blend somewhere. I think in many ways I'm still working it out, but for me, it's been focusing on embarking on physical adventures and testing myself in these remote conditions to learn about the world, learn about wildlife, all these different things I mentioned, but ultimately learn about myself. As I said, I've found this game of adventure so early, so young, and now turning it into a career. I'm still very much growing up in this weird world of adventure and through the lens of travel and whatever you want to call it. So for me, that's what an adventurer is. If you want to break down the logistics, people want a certain answer. It basically means I'm self-employed. I'm on that borderline between being self-employed and unemployed at times, and just trying to turn my adventures into my life, and been lucky to do it for 4 years now. So incredibly lucky.
Yeah, it's really inspiring and truly amazing. And I think maybe we'll come back to it a little bit and talk about some of the practical aspects of this idea of making adventure a career and how some of that works. But you've had some big adventures just in a very, very short period of time, 2023, 2024, accomplishing 2 huge feats that earn you a Guinness World Record. I want to talk about this challenge of running marathons on all 7 continents and swimming marathons on all 7 seas. How did the idea for this develop?
Thank you. Well, the Guinness World Records and becoming the first person in history to run on all 7 continents, swim in all 7 seas, you said, that's sort of the pinnacle of my career and really my life to date. And actually, this is the first podcast and long format conversation I think I've had since receiving these records about 3 months ago. There's a long story to how it all evolved, but essentially these adventures, when I went full time at 22, they built and built and built. And at the same time, well, actually, I'll go into detail. The first adventure I did when I went full time, I knew to start this journey, start this career, I needed to find something which was going to be big. It was going to hopefully get the interest of sponsors. Sponsorship is how you survive as a young explorer and adventurer. I needed to get the attention of media and publicity a little bit, but also I ultimately had to do something to honor my granddad. He was the reason I'd first found this sort of hobby, which was at the time. And I ended up running 17 marathons in 17 consecutive days, honor of the 17 years he lived with dementia. And that was a great project. It was a success. We raised a huge amount of money for charity, and I found my first few sponsors, and momentum started. And later that year in 2022, I then rode the English Channel. I climbed Mont Blanc, Gran Paradiso, swam from Europe to Asia. Like all these little adventures were building and building and building. And at that time, I had a conversation with someone, and they mentioned something called the 7 Continents Marathon Club. And I'd never heard about it before. And instantly I went home. I started researching into the runners, the people. I just became fascinated. I found out there was about 400 people at the time who'd ever run on all 7 continents. I ended up coming up with the idea to become the first person to run in the most remote corners. And I thought I'd add my own little twist onto it. And I ended up running over 14 months through what I perceived to be some of the most remote places on earth. I ran through the Agafe Desert in Northern Africa, the Wadi Rum Desert in Asia, the Alaska in North America, ran through the Australian outback, the Amazon rainforest, the Arctic Circle, and then finally Antarctica. So it was a 14-month project. And really that was my first international, multi-continent, multi-month project. That finished in December 2023. And then last year, 2024, I completed the sequel to that project, which was to swim marathons on all of the 7 seas. And at the time of doing that, we found out there was no one in history who'd ever done both.
Wow.
So there was about 400 people who'd done the runs on all 7 continents. There was one person that we could find who'd ever swam in all of the classical 7 seas. We'd found no one in history had ever achieved both. So that was sort of the pinnacle last year, being recognized by Guinness World Records to being the first in history, which is a pretty special and I think maybe a rare thing in today's world too, to have that sort of accolade.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on each of the 7 continents very quickly. Could you do the same with the 7 seas? You and I kind of laughed a little bit before this. You know, I think most people could tell you what the 7 continents are. I admit the 7 classical seas, I couldn't list them out to you. So could you bring us all into speed? Hopefully I'm not alone, but could you spell out what the 7 seas are for us?
That's okay. And Scott, I'll admit as well, before starting that project, I definitely couldn't name either because people get confused, I think, a little bit between the oceans. There's different definitions of what the 7 seas are too. For me, I took on the 7 classical seas, which is the Red, Arabian, Aegean, Adriatic, Black, Mediterranean, and North Seas. So that's 7 different countries I swam through in the end over 3 different continents. So I swam in the end through Egypt and Oman, which were the Red and Arabian Sea. So that was in the height of summer, incredibly hot, incredibly humid. In fact, the water temperature in the Arabian Sea, for any swimmers out there, was 31 degrees Celsius. So it was like swimming in sort of a mild bath. It was incredibly difficult. Then on to Greece and Italy for the Aegean and Adriatic. The Black Sea was Turkey, the Mediterranean Sea was Spain, and then finished back home in the UK in the North Sea. So it's a huge contrast in, as you can imagine, all the different temperatures and water conditions and climates. But those are the classical 7 seas.
Okay, that's awesome. And there's just so many things that I want to unpack here. And I think what I'd love to do is because we touched on the continents and the seas, is I'd love to talk about just some highlights for people listening, for myself. I mean, you have traveled, you've been all around the world. You've been to all 7 continents. You've experienced like these incredible feats all over the world. And I would love to hear from somebody that has accomplished so much globally, a few highlights, maybe from, maybe a couple of the marathons, maybe a couple of the swims. I'm just curious, like, what are some of the highlights or lowlights of your experiences on these epic journeys?
Well, I think my strongest memories of that whole project all coming together, as you said, was 633 days, right? So it's almost 2 years of my life. And although that was only 7 runs and 7 swims, it's, huge amount of work behind the scenes. 99% of the work I do is behind the scenes. And I think if I reflect on that project and think back to the memories, I think the word that sticks out is contrast. There was just such a varying conditions and wildlife communities with the whole project. If we want to look at maybe the running side, I think the Amazon rainforest sticks out to me, of course. Anyone who's maybe been lucky to learn about the Amazon, let alone travel there, it's one of the most unique and incredible places on earth. We ran on the indigenous land of the Quechua community. It took months and months and months to get their approval and their sort of agreement for us to go around on their land. And we became the first people in history to do so. We stayed on their land too. We ran through obviously Antarctica and the Arctic, two of the most cold and remote places, obviously on completely different sort of opposite ends of the world too. Antarctica, it was minus 25 degrees with wind chill at the time of the marathon. It's like, it's just completely different. You're running with sort of full layers protecting your whole skin. The final piece of advice they give you before they send you out of this tent to run this marathon is enjoy, but remember not to sweat, because if your clothes freeze, you can actually get frostbite and your clothes won't unfreeze until you get back to South America. So all these varying logistics and challenges.
How many people run the Antarctica marathon?
So out of the 7 marathon runs I did, 5 of them were self-organized and 2 of them were organized. And one of the organized ones was Antarctica, because it's the only legal way to run a marathon in the heart of Antarctica. There's a few races, I think, which take place sort of on the outskirts and maybe like the peninsula, but I wanted to run in the heart of Antarctica. And there's something called the Antarctic Ice Marathon. It takes place once a year, every December, at Union Glacier, which is only a few hundred miles from the South Pole. It's the home, I'm sure you've spoke to many people on this show about those who have used Union Glacier as sort of their base camp for adventures in Antarctica, whether it's skiing to the South Pole or climbing mountains there, whatever it might be. I think there's about 70 runners from about 30 or 40 countries every year on average. I think when we were there was maybe 65 to 70 runners.
Got it.
So it's a pretty special and unique race, as you can imagine. And then, of course, I love my time over in North America too. For that leg, I ran in Alaska through the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, which is an incredible place. It was surrounded by brown bears and wolves and reindeers while running. So my highlights of the challenge are everything I experienced, as you said, around the world. And it's not even necessarily about the running. The running was just my medium and my vehicle, should we say, to get to these places and get to experience these different things. And I think the running project was the most incredible privilege ever, being able to see all those places in such a short period. And then for the 7 seas, the first swim in the Red Sea was probably the most beautiful, if we want to say that, for a marathon swim as much as we can. I was swimming basically over all the incredible coral and vibrant fish and wildlife in the Red Sea. It felt like almost snorkeling for about 5 hours. Then as the project continued, we got to some more interesting waters. In the Black Sea, I swam through a jellyfish field of about 300 or 400 jellyfish. That was not as fun. And then finished back home in the North Sea, which was just basically pitch black below and just tasted of petrol. So that was more of a low. But I think there's so many highlights, and probably could speak all day about that project and go into detail of all the different continents. But, it's just in those 633 days to experience everything from jungles to deserts to different seas. It's just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh, it's just hard to get my head around. Were there any struggles that you experienced that really stick out?
There's plenty, of course. There's far more struggles than successes as well. That's what maybe people don't see, or maybe those who have experienced a little bit of this world will understand. But yeah, so many struggles. And there's so many struggles before you even get to the start line. Everything from the logistics, the sponsorship, the media, everything. The majority of the work I do, I lead myself. I'm in control of all I do. And I'm, sometimes a one-man team in that sense. So there's so many challenges behind the scenes before you even get to that start line. And maybe, as you said, we can get into what it means actually to be an adventurer in that sense from a logistical standpoint. But if we look at the actual challenges during the runs, then yeah, of course, as you can see, I'm a redhead, so running through 40-degree deserts is no easy feat. It's incredibly difficult. I remember being chased by wild dogs in the Agafe deserts, which is like a story you read about in books and you never think is going to happen to you, and then suddenly you're brought back to reality. As I said, Antarctica was so cold, huge risks of frostbite and various different issues like hypothermia. That was probably the hardest run I've ever taken on. just because it was so difficult. I remember there was moments actually during the Antarctica run where the snow got picked up by the wind. We were running quite close to something called the Ellis Mountains, which were trying to protect us as much as possible from the wind. But the snow just got picked up and it just hit me from the right-hand side. And obviously when you're wearing these big ski goggles and you're covered in hats and gloves, your vision's really impaired. And I remember just thinking like I was having some sort of internal bleeding or something was happening because I wasn't, drinking or eating correctly, and looking down and it was just the snow just hitting my body from the right-hand side. And it's just one of those challenges you never expect or prepare for when you're back home training. And then during the swims, we had some huge challenges logistically. We had on average, so the runs took 14 months, but the swims, I tried to do it all in 7 weeks. And we ended up beating that by 3 days.
Wow.
And that meant we were pretty much taking on a swim, flying to the next place, having a few day weather window, and then flying on to the next place. And I felt like a weatherman for about 7 weeks because I've never studied the weather or studied the seas or the conditions so much. And it meant sometimes we could just never get the perfect weather window. So we just have to go out and swim in what we could. And sometimes it feels like you're swimming in a washing machine. Sometimes we're having to start in the afternoon rather than the morning, which means we're trying to beat the sunset, which of course you never want to swim in the dark, or you want to try and avoid it as much as possible because boats and support crews just can't see you. So huge amount of logistics and challenges for all these different reasons. But I think those are a few of the key ones that stand out.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I'm sitting here. I love the word awe, and Louis, I'm in awe of you. It's interesting. There's a lot of things that I'd like to come back to. You talked about 17 marathons, 17 days in honor of 17 years. Obviously, I think that number holds some significant meaning for you. And also in this conversation just now, you said 663 days. It was only 7 marathons and 7 swims. And I think that reflects like only 7 swims and only 7 like to most people, that's like beyond a lifetime. And it just reflects such a big mindset. And so I love if we could just kind of get into that a little bit, because you have so many like accomplishments, and we could talk about the specific accomplishments themselves. That could take hours and hours to go through all of them. But I think for me, it's about like the development of this mindset. And I do recognize that in adventure, there's this balance between what a person thinks they can accomplish and then the challenge itself. And you have to kind of have like some degree of balance there, because if it's too unrealistic, you just won't even try. If it's too easy, then it becomes boring. And so I guess I just wonder like how your mindset has developed over the years, and how you go from being, well, I guess we need to get into that too, kind of like childhood and where you started to kind of where you are today, to be able to accomplish all that you have in 2 years. I mean, it's incredible. How did that mindset develop over time?
Well, thank you, by the way. Really, really kind words. It actually means far more than you know. I think the thing with mindset, which I think we don't talk about enough, is it's funny how quickly perspective changes. And you're right. Maybe, when I was 19, if I would have never said those words of it was only 7 run, swim, because back then it would have been a huge amount. But it's funny how quickly perspective can change. It can change rapidly. And it's not just me that my perspective changes, but it's funny, you notice your perspective of people around you, the important people around you, changes too. And I remember a few months ago, when I finished the project and got these Guinness World Records, and I was thinking and planning for what's next. And I remember mentioning to my parents, they're always the first people I go to with, what do you think of this idea? And it was like, yeah, it's pretty good, you can do it. But if a few years ago I would have mentioned that idea to them, to do this again, what's hopefully going to be a world record, they would have reacted very differently. So it's interesting how perspective can change, and that's just, I guess, down to achievements and making a promise and sticking to your word. It's pretty incredible how that boundary just keeps increasing. I think there's so many things I could talk about with mindset. I think it's arguably far more important than the physical side of what we do. I think in many ways, training camps are for our physical needs and body, but these actual adventures and all the challenges, they are about mindset. And it's this idea, it's like a callus, it's something you just build up, and it's like a resilience. And it's, the greatest thing with mindset is it's about confidence. For me, it's that balance between embarking on something which is scary enough where it still excites you, and as well, something you have to think about as an adventurer is commercially, does it excite other people? Will you get the publicity and sponsorship and stuff like that to actually make it feasible? But it's that balance of, can I actually do this? And more importantly, do I want to do this? So for me, the first decision I make about a challenge once I come up with an idea is actually, do I want to do this? Because if I commit to it, I will 100% do it. And that 100% becomes even stronger and stronger, because when I get closer to the challenge, I start to develop what could be viewed as naivety. It could be viewed as almost ego, but I call it like the invincibility mode. And it's this idea that when I step into the water of a swim, when I enter onto the ground of a run, whatever I'm about to do, I will 100% do this. There's not a doubt in my mind. And let's be honest, we're sat here now, we're both in our homes, we're having a comfortable, enjoyable chat. I can now reflect outside of that adventure mode in my head and say, that's naivety, right? Of course, there's things outside of my control. When you step in to swim for 3, 4, 5 hours in the water or longer, there's things outside of our control, right? The conditions could change, the support crews could fail, or something could go wrong. But when I step into the water, I think I will 100% do it. It's this invincibility mode. So you have to protect yourself with that, and you have to put the right people in place to make decisions for you should you think you can battle on and continue. But I think there is a balance between finding something that scares you enough to embark on it, and it interests you, it excites you, but also something you want to do and know you can do. But there's a huge amount of naivety involved with, I think, adventure. And I think that those two words are synonymous in many ways.
Hey everyone, it's Scott here. This podcast is a passion project for me because I absolutely love adventure. And it's thanks to the effort of my residential real estate team here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that many of you know as the W Realty Group, that this podcast gets funded. This awesome group of people have unmatched levels of competence and caring for our clients. If you know of anyone looking to buy or sell a home, our team serves the Charlotte, North Carolina market, but we can also help you find an agent anywhere throughout the US or Canada through our highly connected network. When you support our real estate business, you are also supporting this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your referrals. So it's interesting because you almost picked up on a question I was formulating in my mind when you just kind of went down that path. So I think you kind of already answered this, but I was curious, when you set out on this adventure, I just heard you say, once I commit, I will 100% do this. So what I'm hearing you say is like, you're choosing these adventures, you're making up your mind in advance that you're going to finish. Because I guess what I was going to ask was like, do you ever set out on one of these adventures just with sort of the mindset, like, let's see what happens? Or is it always like, you know exactly how it's going to end and you're just charging forward, like knowing that you're going to finish the journey?
I think it's the latter for me. But of course, that's at this stage of my career. As my career builds and hopefully the projects build and maybe the risks build too, say with climbing bigger and bigger mountains, of course, then maybe I'll have to, put a sort of a wiser head on my shoulders and be a lot more thoughtful and, sensible maybe. Yeah. But at the moment, for the last few years, it's very much been a decision of, if I say I'm going to do something, I 100% am going to do it.
And I think that's so important. I mean, like, when you've got this huge challenge, to be able to just make up your mind, like, failure's not an option, I'm going to go do this. Like, to accomplish all that you've accomplished, I feel like you have to have that mindset. But then I am curious, like, where you bring in the piece where, you are able to recognize when there's a dangerous situation that you hear about people that, like, I was just reading about Mount Everest, and they have this, like, when you climb Mount Everest, when you hit 2:00, it's time to turn around. Right. And I'm just curious, like, if you have any sort of built-in, like, heuristics around that to protect you in the event of something like in other words, this confidence that you have that says, I'm going to do this, something that throttles that if there's a real danger. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think, it's important to address that none of the things I've ever done, I've done without a support crew. So everything I do, I would do with a support crew. I only ever pick support crews that I actually really, first of all, like, but also secondly, trust. It's one of the most important parts of my planning process. And they do have that decision, right? And fortunately, we've never had to get to that stage. We've been able to continue and push on through all these things. But of course, I do these adventures because I want to live. I don't do them because I want to die. I certainly don't have a death wish, And if one day, God willing, I'm able to take on Everest, for example, as you mentioned, if that takes 2, 3, 4 attempts to get up there and get, more importantly, back home safely, then of course. And that's why, in many ways, my trajectory and the plan for my career is to build things up progressively. The reason I have climbed smaller mountains like Mont Blanc or Kilimanjaro and not gone straight up to Everest and the big Himalayas is because, I'm just not there yet. I have to build up my physical ability, clearly my mental ability, my everything from the logistics, the funding, everything's got to build up. So I think definitely that's my response to the dangers and the logistics when it comes to that side of things, is building things up progressively.
I just picked up on something that you said I just think is really just truly amazing. You have this amazing support crew that you trust, and you've kind of delegated to them that piece where if it's time to turn around, they get to make that call. And I know you said that you didn't have to, but that way it allows you to be 100% committed to just, you don't have to have any fear or doubt because you know that they've got that covered, is what I'm hearing you say. So in other words, you can make up your mind, I'm going to do this. You can charge forward with full confidence that your support crew is going to pull you out if they need to.
100%. And, I think the perfect example of that was that first adventure when I went full time was 3 years ago. Actually, at this time I ran the 17 marathon, 17 consecutive days. And on day 10, I woke up with shin splints, chest infection, and a fever. And at the time, my parents were my chief support crew. My parents are really my biggest support, so I can't pick them up enough. And I remember on that day 10, waking up in shivers of pain. It was something I never experienced before. My mum, she knocked on the door, she came into my room and she saw me shivering in pain. I was like a broken man. And she looked at me very clearly in the eyes and she said, "Son, do you want to run today?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Do you want to quit?" And I said, "No." And I got out of bed, I put on my running shoes, and that first, I think it was 10 kilometers on day 10, took 3 hours. And those first 9 days, I'd been averaging 5-hour marathons. So you can see already how difficult it was. And my parents were blessed, and they were phoning doctors and physios, trying to get people to work with us. And they all refused. They said, "We won't start working with him until he stops running." And I said very clearly, "Well, I don't want anyone to work with me who doesn't understand how important this is." And the reason I say that is because my parents, my mum especially, she didn't make that decision at the time. But she gave me the responsibility to make that decision for myself, because she knew me well enough to say, he can continue. He's obviously in this difficult state, but he has to make that decision right now. Of course, if it got worse and worse, I'm sure my mum would have made that decision for me. But the idea then of not wanting to welcome on other outdoor and external people to say, like doctors who are going to stop me, is because also fundamentally the people I bring on my support crews also have to know how far I can try and push it. So I am bringing on people who can make those decisions, but I'm also bringing on people who have very much the same values of tenacity, perseverance, and risk-taking that I carry. Yeah. And when I reflected on that project many weeks later, my mum, and she said, watching me on day 10 walk off and hobbling in pain, she said it was the most painful moment of her life. She literally broke down in tears. She was feeding me these painkillers and sending me off. And I appreciate that can come across quite badly. But if you understand me and my parents and, the story they've been through, you understand that me not continuing and me failing that challenge would have been far more catastrophic than if I had stopped on day 10. Wow. Yes, there was the risk I was going to get these shin splints. They were going to get worse and worse. But hey, those shin splints were going to recover. They took a few weeks when I finished. And yes, they were very painful. And yes, the pain was temporary. But for my mind, completing that first adventure, committing to the words that I said that I'm going to honor my granddad for the 17 years, and we had people every day from the public coming to join us, whether it's for 1 mile, for the whole marathon. I had little kids running alongside me. That was far more important to complete that challenge, to honor my granddad, to fulfill my word, than it was to quit because of some temporary pain like shin splints. So I think, yes, support crews are very, very important to make that decision, but they also have to carry the same values as you do when it comes to keep going when things get tough. So there's a balance again, as with everything, but with support crews too.
It makes sense though. You need people in your support crew that believe in you and understand the capabilities that you have. Oh man, so good. So you mentioned Granddad a few times. I'd love to go there. Could we kind of go back in time a little bit and talk about your first adventures and your inspiration to kind of go off on this journey?
Sure. I mean, my granddad was very much the reason this all started for me. His name was Captain Rick Taylor. He served in the British Army for 38 years. He served all around the world, but it was sadly his battle against dementia, which ended his life. And I think, dementia is huge worldwide. I've no doubt it's sadly huge in America too, right? It's very well known out there. And he was very much an adventurer and explorer in his own right. And shortly after finishing school when I was 18, I was having a conversation with my mum, and she told me about this dream of his, which was to go out and climb Kilimanjaro. But obviously he was so ill at that point. He'd been in a hospital bed for 3 or 4 years that was never going to sadly come true. And I remember when she told me that, I had this like sudden need and responsibility, like, okay, I've got to go out there. I've got to do this for him and for our family. The only issue was I'd never climbed a mountain before. I'd never been on an expedition. I didn't even know where to start. And that began this sort of 9-month journey, shall we say, is probably the perfect word, but to find out how to do it. So that meant signing up for an expedition company. It meant buying hiking shoes for the first time, training with a backpack, all these classic things that those who've climbed Kilimanjaro or a serious experience would know about. And 1 week on that mountain, I was very lucky to get up and summit and come back down with struggle, right? I struggled that whole week. But that 1 week on the mountain changed my whole life. It changed my whole perspective. It gave me this new purpose, which I never knew I had. And I had gone out there, yes, for him, for the charity, but I also returned home with something for myself, which was this newfound love for travel and adventure and challenge and pushing myself and meeting like-minded people. It was like a 360 thing. And, for 3 years, that hobby built from the age of 19 till 22. And I think what's so important to reference with that time was during, COVID and several lockdowns. And that meant planning projects getting cancelled. It meant, I remember at the time I did a challenge, which was like 20 challenges in 2020 at 20 years old. Now looking back, it's a terrible challenge in terms of commercial angle because it's such a mouthful. No one's going to remember it. But at the time, I remember completing the first challenge in 2020 and then getting in the lockdowns were announced and all 19 of the rest of the events were cancelled. I literally woke up one day to 19 cancellation emails, and it meant learning those key, needs for adventure in all different levels of resilience and bouncing back and adapting when needed. And that was like sort of such a key process and key moment for dealing with those challenges behind the scenes too. And that built. And then, at 22 years old, I realized kind of that I only love one thing in life, and it was these adventures and this hobby. And I sort of asked myself, can you turn a hobby into a career? And realized if I was ever going to have the opportunity to do it, it was there and then. I had no commitments to children or to anything like that. I just had to go for it. And I was very, very fortunate to find that passion at a young age. I appreciate many people don't get that privilege, but I was very lucky, and I realized I just couldn't waste that opportunity. And I decided to go for it. And somehow 4 years later, or 3.5 years later, we're here today.
Yeah, it's amazing, man. So confession moment here, right? Like I can't really get my head around 7 marathons on all 7 continents, 7 marathons in the 7 seas. Like it blows my mind. Yet I've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and that's where you started. So I'm like, okay, it's so interesting. I want to ask you, because for me personally, I've been there. I've witnessed the epic nature of the roof of Africa. It's incredible. What happened to you inside on Kilimanjaro?
Well, I definitely want to know about your experience too. But I think what year did you climb Kilimanjaro?
2022.
Recent, 3 years ago. Wow. Yeah. Okay. And what route did you take?
Machame.
Okay. Same route as me. Is that called the
Barranco Wall?
Or Barranco Wall.
Yeah.
It was truthfully the most humbling experience of my life. I remember I'd played rugby at school and I'd been quite a sporty kid. And I remember getting to this mountain and turning up, and I was like the youngest of the group and feeling all these things of confidence of for 9 months at home, I've been telling people, yeah, I'm going off to climb Kilimanjaro. Yeah, I'm doing this. And people going, what do you mean you're doing that? Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm doing it for my granddad, and feeling this real, ego going into the mountain. And I remember on day 2, the altitude sickness hit me like a brick wall. And I'd made silly decisions of, oh, right, I don't need trekking poles. You know, I can walk without trekking poles. Oh, I don't need altitude sickness pills. You know, I don't need those. And there was all these little decisions I'd made of, yeah, I'm just going to stroll up there. And as you know, and anyone who's tackled Kilimanjaro, regardless of your experience, your ability, you could be the greatest climber in the world. Kilimanjaro is a humbling mountain, and any mountain can't be underestimated. It's almost 6,000 meters tall, right? So for your first big mountain, for my first adventure ever, it was, you know, maybe quite a big one in retrospect. And I just remember being humbled so much and just thinking, hang on, I'm not going to fly up this mountain. I'm not going to do it, you know, with a lot of glamour and sort of whatever. This is going to be a real struggle, and just having to try and as much as possible, lose that ego and just try and find some inner confidence to get up there. And I think that was the key takeaway for me climbing that mountain and coming home, you know, and for those few years that hobby built, I think that's what I tried to replace, was that inner confidence and thinking, right, am I doing this because I actually want to do it and I can do it? Or am I doing it for these other reasons? And it was just the most transformative and life-changing experience ever. It taught me so much. It's crazy how a week on a mountain can teach you almost more than a whole year at school. It's like an unbelievable experience, isn't it? And you learn so much about different communities and people and everything. It's unbelievable. What was your takeaways from the mountain?
Oh, I mean, so many. I mean, I think that like the inner confidence that you just talked about, I think that's huge. I mean, the whole thing was struggle. And I can tell you, like my guide, and yours probably told you the same thing, but my guide, we did like a briefing the night before we started. And I think his biggest takeaway was what we're about to do. Yes, it's a physical thing that we're going to do, but really 90% of what we're about to do is a mental challenge. You're going to feel sick. You're going to feel altitude. Like you're going to feel all these things, and it's what you do with it. It's mentally what you do with it. And I've told this story, you know, for me on the summit night, it was intense. And I literally had to count my breath in order to, like, I literally counted breath for 6 hours to distract my mind from the barrage of negative thoughts that were like, you can't do this. Like, how can you go home and tell people that you didn't summit? And like, you know, what if you get sick? Just, it was incessant. It wouldn't stop. And the only way that I could keep it at bay was to count my breath. And so honestly, like that was probably one of my biggest takeaways, was acknowledging this barrage of negative thinking for me personally, and how to overcome that through just, you know, being uber aware and just distracting your mind through breath. Like that, truthfully, that, man, there's so many different takeaways that I could talk about, but that was probably one of the biggest ones for me.
But isn't that like so reflective of like every big achievement in life and all these big challenges of life? Is like, to achieve these biggest things, these biggest achievements, it comes down to the smallest of actions. Yeah. And that small action of just focusing on 2 steps at a time, 2 breaths at a time, that got you to the top of the mountain and down. And it's like, you just never expect when you first sign up for a thing like that, or you hear about it, or you find out someone else is doing it, you never think, oh, the reason they got to the top was because they just took 1 step at a time and they just focused on one breath. You think, oh, they did it because they did all this glamorous training. And it's like, no, you just stick to the basics. And that is so reflective of all my adventures, all of my few achievements, and hopefully will be for the rest of my career. It's just focused on those small things. Sometimes they're boring. Sometimes they're repetitive. For 6 hours, I'm sure, that was very challenging just to keep reminding yourself. But it got you to the top.
By the way, I just have to add, so it turns out that my climbing partner, Carl, was doing the same thing. He was also counting breath. Right. He was counting to 250 and then starting over again. All I could manage was 10.
Wow, even 10's a lot.
I counted to 10 and then I'd start over. He was counting to 250.
Wow. Yeah. 250. He just found that was a special number.
I don't know. He was counting he was counting his breaths up to 250 and then starting over again. All I could manage was 10. And if I got to 10, I was lucky. I digress. Louis, I want to talk a little bit. So I want to come back to Granddad, and your desire to sort of honor his wish of climbing Kilimanjaro, but then taking on these additional adventures. So I read something on your website that when you did the 7 marathons, you actually carried a letter with you. And it was really kind of an honor to your grandpa. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, a big part of all my adventures has been supporting these amazing charities, and we've raised, tens of thousands, which is amazing. But something I learned during that running project was actually sometimes to make real change, it comes down to raising and focusing on awareness rather than donations. And for me, that meant during the running project on World Alzheimer's Day on Sky News, I announced an open letter to the Prime Minister, which commercially and sort of in terms of trying to make an impact in that world, it was the biggest thing I'd done at the time. And I remember carrying that letter with me for the final few marathons, and I was sending these videos out on social media, holding this letter, trying to address the Prime Minister and just essentially get his attention. And what we were asking for at the time was a focus on dementia diagnostics. There's a big issue over here in the UK. I'm not sure if it's similar in America, about people just not simply being diagnosed. I think 1 in 3 people are never diagnosed here, which means if you're not diagnosed, you can't then get the right care and treatment you need. And it's really sad. And in the end, we got invited to go to number 10 after getting home from Antarctica to deliver this letter. And 2 months later, I got a letter back from the Prime Minister himself, signed, saying we're going to increase the rate from, I think it was like a 1 in 3 or 2 in 3. I can't remember the exact detail, but like to try and make this real commitment to change for dementia diagnostics, which was amazing. And it was like the first little thing I'd seen where actually these adventures can actually raise the real awareness and attention of what arguably is some of the most important people in the world. And if I can raise £100,000 with for a charity with a challenge, that's amazing. But if I can get the government to increase funding from 0.01% to 0.02%, that's millions and millions. And that's governmental systematic change. And that's what we need, right? And I think many adventurers should use that for all their projects, and whether they're raising awareness for mental health or for a certain charity, whatever it is. I think it's pretty incredible that these adventures can get the attention of anyone. It doesn't have to be in the adventure world. It could be government leaders. And for me going forward, that's going to be a big focus on what I'm doing. And that was inspired. I can't take credit for that. That's inspired by someone called Lewis Pugh. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he's one of the greatest adventure swimmers. I think he's called the Edmund Hillary of the swimming world. He's incredible. And he got the attention of the Prime Minister during one of his most famous swims in the North Pole, I think, 20 years ago. And that inspired me to try and recreate it almost and use it for dementia. Was very lucky actually a few months ago. I went back to number 10 and they asked me to be the guest speaker at their Q&A series, which was pretty amazing. So it's pretty incredible to think what these adventures can do. I never would have expected it when it all started as a hobby.
Hey everyone, it's Scott here. Did you know that the members of my real estate team, W Realty Group, are listening to their own voices that call to adventure by setting big goals? Some of those goals include planning trips to Bali and the Kingdom of Bhutan, buying investment homes, and running the Chicago Marathon. At W Realty Group, we support and encourage these big goals and want to help turn them into reality. We're currently looking to add new members to the team. If you know a great real estate agent in the Charlotte, North Carolina area that would benefit from being part of our team, please send a text, an email, or give me a call. And know that when you support W Realty Group, you're also supporting this podcast. Thanks for listening. I never would have expected it. I mean, I would really love to touch on this because where does this connection between I'm climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, I'm building this inner confidence, recognizing that I can do these incredible things. And it seems very, on the surface, very selfish. I'm just going to go do these adventures that I really want to do. But there's this bigger element. People are very inspired by this. And then when you attach your wish to raise awareness for some cause that's meaningful for you, for it to then snowball into getting the attention of the Prime Minister and increasing, how does that all happen?
Well, it's ultimately, I guess it's a decision. It's this understanding that, okay, great, these adventures are maybe going to now get me onto a TV show, whatever it is. Why wouldn't I use that platform for something bigger than myself? And let's be totally honest, the reason I found that first adventure was because of my granddad and his battle with dementia. It was a very sad story of someone who was an incredible man, dedicated his life to the country and lost his life to this cruel illness. And it was turning that sad story then into a story of almost hope and positivity by climbing Kilimanjaro, raising money for charity, to try and support people in the future who suffer with the same illness. And I owe a huge part of my journey to that. So there's that selfish reason of trying to give back. But it's now this understanding of, hang on, these adventures are actually bigger than just the running or the swimming. In fact, the running and the swimming doesn't mean anything. It's about what you do with it. But let's also be very clear. You can lose opportunities doing this full time by supporting charities. Commercially, if I was to just focus on myself, it'd be much easier if I didn't always support charities, because sometimes sponsors want focus on them and stuff like that. I mean, that's the sad truth. So it is very much a decision of saying, no, I want to stick to supporting charities, what I'm doing, because I know in the long run, not for my legacy or my career achievements, my Wikipedia page, no, for myself, what means the most. And for me, that's using these ventures for something bigger than just myself.
It's awesome, Louis. Listen, we spoke a couple of weeks ago, and in that conversation, you might not remember this, but you talked to me, and I think you mentioned this happening on Kilimanjaro, but you talked to me about feeling a fire inside of yourself. And this is Inspire Campfire. It's all about listening to the voice inside that calls us to adventure. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that means to feel a fire inside of yourself, and what does it feel like?
For me, the fire is the word purpose. And I think purpose is genuinely the most powerful thing we can feel, especially during times of difficulty. It's that almost calling. It's that inner fire. It's that inner feeling of, I want to be here. I should be here. And I deserve to be here maybe too sometimes. And for me, purpose is, with these adventures, has changed my life, because I had an incredible childhood, but I certainly didn't have this purpose through my childhood of, oh, I want to do this, I want to become an adventurer. It hit me like that at 19, and to find it so unexpectedly was a real shock, but it was also the most welcoming thing, because it just changed everything for me. So that inner fire, when times are great, is of course a positive, but when things are going more difficultly, such as on an adventure like swimming in the Arabian Sea when it's 31 degrees, or whether it's running through a rainstorm in the Amazon, whether it's running through the heat of the desert of Northern Africa being chased by wild dogs, that inner fire is that pull. And we can all be motivated by many different things at many different times. Sometimes those motivations can be external. We're trying to impress someone. We're doing it. Oh, this photo will look great for social media. Sure, that's great, but that's on the surface. But purpose and having an inner fire is much deeper than that. It's internal. It's deep rooted to who we are and to our souls. And for me, that fire is my purpose, and it's carried me to where I am. It's carried me through these hardest times. It's made, these Guinness World Records. Yes, the adventures were difficult, but getting home, it took months and months of verification to get through the approvals. It literally took ages. We had to submit hundreds of pieces of data to get through that, to go through it and know I'm doing this for the right reasons. Is that inner purpose. It's that fire and that fuel. And I just pray and hope I can keep this and hold it and nurture it for the rest of my career, because the day it stops is the day I will stop my adventures. Because as we spoke about before, taking those risks, doing things because it's for money or for sponsorship, that's not real. Doing it for that inner purpose is real, and that will fight through those difficult times.
Man, it's incredible wisdom from a 26-year-old, a 25-year-old. Yeah.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Man.
Well, it's just my opinion. It's just my perspective. And I've got to give a lot of credit to the people around me too, who I've gained wisdom from, I like to think.
Could we just take a minute? I know one of the questions that you get often is the practical question about financially, how you're able to make all of this work. Could you just kind of share a little bit about how being a professional adventurer works financially? How do you make it work?
I think it's an important question to ask. In fact, it's one of the most common questions I get during my school talks. I've spoken to over 10,000 school students now around Europe, and it's funny, their questions are often so practical. What running shoes do you wear? How do you make money? Are you verified on Instagram? It's very funny, some of their very practical questions. And the career way and how do you actually make this work? How do you make money? I think is very, very important to address, because when I started and decided to try and make it a career, at 22, there was very much no blueprint. I was lucky to have some advice from a couple mentors at the time, but they very much as well openly admitted, there is no blueprint to making this a career, making this your life. You can look up to, who's the perfect example? Okay, so Bear Grylls, right? He's huge in both our countries, I believe. He's huge in America, right? He's got all these shows. So he's obviously focused on something like television, film. So that's a huge medium. I think ultimately okay, let's break it down even further. So being an adventurer and do it full time, you have to try and turn your physical achievements into commercial achievements. And you have to find your medium to doing that. For someone like Bear Grylls, it is television, it's films, it's writing books. For me, the focus in the last 3 or 4 years has been sponsorship. So I've worked with over 20, 25 sponsors. So all of my adventures are covered by sponsorship. So I don't touch any of the charity money. It's totally separate. And I also had, for the last 2 years, I had a sponsor who was paying me a salary. And in return for that salary and that monthly retainer, I was then going off to do talks, and I was doing talks for their clients. And that's also another big part of what I do is public speaking. So it could be speaking at corporate events, at schools, at special dinners, whatever it is. It's just about sharing a story, and storytelling is ultimately the way to make this a career. And hopefully as my career builds, I've got an exciting meeting next month. And as things are building, as you know, my big dream is to become a television presenter and to have my own travel shows. I'd love one day to write books, but you've got to earn those steps and those career achievements, right? But the focus for me at the moment is sponsorship. And you know what? There are some incredible people out there. There's some incredible companies who want to support people of all ages, from all backgrounds, to do these things, because sometimes these adventures are inspiring. Sometimes people want to be inspired. They want to be associated and attached to stories of success and stories of people taking risks. And it's funny, you never know who's going to just bite on and sponsor you or support you. You just never know. They could come from any background and have any association. It's really, really strange, but it's a very important question. It's always one I'm happy to discuss. And it's probably the most common question I get in my, Instagram requests and things like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I'm curious, like when you go back to the 17 or 18-year-old before you went to Kilimanjaro, and then you kind of reflect, I mean, this is, it's only been 6 years. Like when you look back at that person against the person that you are today, like how have you changed in 5 or 6 years?
I'd like to think I've changed a lot. I would hate to think I'm the same person, because I think these adventures they've warranted a lot of risk. They've warranted a lot of effort. And I like to think I've come out of them a better person. That is my big goal with every adventure, is I come out a little bit wiser, a little bit more confident, a little bit more relaxed with who I am. And I like to think I try and become a better person with each one. And there's so many, but it's so strange because, maybe if I hadn't taken on these adventures and I'd gone down a different path, would I have still improved? Yeah, hopefully. Going from 18 to 25 is a transformative time for most people, but it's like I've gone through this very unique experience of growing up now through this world of adventure. And it's like some of these big milestones of my life have been through adventure and expeditions and challenges, whereas some people maybe go through university or more traditional routes of work, which also have their own challenges, I'm absolutely certain. But it's like I'm growing up through this weird world of adventure, and it's quite unique, I think, to say the least. And I like to think hopefully it's rewarding too with the person I'm becoming.
Yeah. And I mean, you're in your mid-20s. I mean, you've got your whole life ahead of you and you've already done so much. Like, what's next for you?
Thank you. Well, ultimately is to continue. This is the beginning, right? It's the start. And as you said, I'm young, and I've hopefully got much more to give and much more to do. And I'd like to hopefully go on 2 or 3 more big projects and world records this year. I'd like to take my first few steps into the world of television and potentially doing a little bit of writing. So I've got some goals, both in terms of the adventures and also the commercial side of where I'd like to take my career this year. And I think with Guinness World Records, these opportunities I've had the last few months, like being a speaker at Number 10 and National Geographic, as you mentioned, hopefully we're now going to move to the second part of my career and my trajectory moving forward. So it's certainly an exciting time, but it's, that's all the highlights, right? It's also challenges behind the scenes. And I think something I missed and forgot to mention during, that question of how do you turn this a career? There was a huge amount of risk that people don't see. I don't come from a family with loads of money and my parents bankrolling me. No, that's not the case. There was a huge risks with taking loans out and credit cards. And, you can't ask anyone else to invest in you before you invest in yourself. And hey, that situation may come again in the future. And you know what? If that purpose and that fire, like we've said, is still there, then no doubt I'll take the same risk and continue on through. So there's some exciting times ahead, but I'm also sure there's some difficult times ahead too. And you know what, we need those moments to humble us, don't we? And to keep us grounded with are we actually doing this for the right reasons? So exciting and difficult moments ahead for sure.
I got to ask you. So in the intro for this podcast, we say that these are campfire stories, right? These are meant to inspire others to listen to the voice inside that calls to adventure. But specifically, we say it's extraordinary stories of ordinary people, right? And you strike me as far beyond ordinary. But I'm just curious, can you speak to the listeners out there? Like, do you consider yourself to be an ordinary person?
What is an ordinary person, Scott? That would be my question. I mean, I don't know anyone that's ordinary. I certainly don't think you're ordinary. Your energy and your ability to talk is amazing. So I wouldn't say you're ordinary at all. And I don't know anyone that's ordinary. I think I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
I love that answer. We're all extraordinary, Louis.
Yeah, we are. I mean, we're all so unique. And I think the more sometimes we're privileged enough to get to travel around the world. And as you said, I've been lucky to go to some of these remote places, and you realize that actually no one is ordinary. There is no normal. We are all just extraordinary in our own unique ways. And what we consider to be normal in our parts of the world and our societies are so different and so unique. And it's not this question of comparing each other, but it's just this question of appreciating all of our different backgrounds and strengths and weaknesses. And it's pretty amazing, but I'm not sure how to answer that question truthfully.
Oh, you answered it. It was a magical answer. Thank you so much for that. How can people follow you, get involved, help you, be part of your journey?
Oh, you're so sweet. Well, I guess ultimately social media. I'm Louis Alexander Explorer on Instagram and TikTok. I'm on YouTube. I'm trying to get into YouTube a little bit. I might need a bit of your advice on that, and LinkedIn and things like that. But yeah, any support is hugely appreciated because it's just the beginning, and I'd love for people to hopefully support from the beginning of this journey to one day when we do achieve some real success together. So everyone's more than welcome to join the train and carry on with me.
That's awesome. Louis, I mean, you've done so much in such a short period of time. Just, you've lived this epic life. I mean, and I know there's so much more to come, but at some point, Hollywood's going to pick up on your story and they're going to want to make a movie about you and your life. And I'm just curious, when they do, who's going to be the Hollywood actor that's going to play you in your movie?
I guess we've got to go realistic here, right? We've got to go. It's got to be a redhead actor, right? It's got to be, to keep that authenticity, to keep that. We've got to have a ginger actor. So, hey, I'm going to throw in Rupert Grint in Harry Potter. What a great guy, great actor. And
nice. I love
I couldn't have anyone play me who's not a redhead. It wouldn't feel right. So
that's amazing. Great answer. What's your movie going to be called?
Okay, so a less light-hearted answer. I'd give you a really deep answer to finish, which is, the greatest words, in my opinion, ever written is a poem called If by Rudyard Kipling. I'm not sure if you've heard it. It's a poem that my granddad gave to my dad. It's a poem that my dad gave to me. It's a poem about the balance of life, the perspective of life. It's the words I have sort of tattooed on my shoulders. And the lines I have on my arm are, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. And it's this whole balance of life and learning how to deal with challenges and setbacks and taking risks. It's the words that my dad gave to me to hopefully try and live my life. It's how he's lived his life, and it's now what I want to try and do. So I would call the film If. Wow. To honor that. But I don't know if I get sued by his, or Rudyard Kipling's estate or something like that. So I might have to buy the rights. But if I could, that's what I call it, because I think those are the greatest words ever written. And hey, maybe it turn into a decent film. But if you want a more light-hearted answer, we might need something like, The Amateur Adventurer or something like that. I don't know. I think that If, and I'm going to go check out the poem. I'm not familiar with it, but I promise when we hang up here, I'm going to be checking that out. That was a mic drop, and certainly I got nothing left. Listen, thank you. This has been such a fun conversation. I really appreciate your time. And for those listening, I hope you've been inspired today as much as I have. I hope Louis' story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or just need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thanks for listening. Louis, thank you so much for being here. My absolute pleasure. It's been an honor. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity.